So welcome to today's ICA Lunch and Learn. This session is provided to you by the ICA New Music Committee. And we're going to be led today by Christopher Nichols. Chris is the associate professor of clarinet and the Woodwind area coordinator at the University of Delaware School of Music. And also a member of the ICA New Music Committee. Chris is also former secretary of the ICA board, just finished his term last year. So we're really excited to present this session to you today, especially if you are interested in participating in our competition, because this work, the sonata is actually on the high school repertoire for the high school competition. So get your clarinets out and feel free to ask any questions in the chat. We'll have plenty of time for that. And I'm going to get out of the way and turn this over to Dr. Nichols so he can walk you through the piece.
Good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's Lunch and Learn. Thank you to the ICA New Music Committee for organizing these events, and also thank you to Jessica Harry, the Executive Director of Operations for ICA, for handling technology and getting the registration set up and all that good stuff, and promotion as well. So really appreciate her work. This afternoon, we're focusing on Germaine Tailleferre's Sonata for Clarinet Solo, which is prescribed repertoire for the 2023 ICA High School Solo Competition. I first became acquainted with Tailleferre's music in the summer of 2020, as I was examining unaccompanied clarinet literature for professional and pedagogical reasons at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this one came up. I was also particularly interested in looking at the music of women composers and Latino and African-American, basically underrepresented composers. So Tailleferre is an exceptionally important example from France. She was the sole female of the group of French composers that would be known as Les Six, along with Auric, Doré, Honegger, Millot, and Poulenc. Tailleferre's catalog for clarinet actually includes a healthy number of chamber works that have clarinet in it, but there's only two works that feature the instrument in the solo capacity. This work, the Sonata for Clarinet Solo of 1957, is the first example. And the second example is her Arabesque for clarinet and piano, which is a little bit later, composed in 1973. Tailleferre lived from 1892 to 1983, and her music shows the influence of a wide variety of developments in music over the course of her lifetime. However, her clarinet sonata is pretty unique. It has a serial sort of sound to it, but it's not, in fact, serial music. Some might think that it's kind of poking fun at this compositional language. This contrasts with her more typically conservative, but I think like a charming sound world. So I actually wanted to quickly listen together to an excerpt of her Arabesque for clarinet and piano to get an idea of what her music more typically, I think, sounded like. So I'm going to get that drummed up, and we'll just listen to about maybe the first 30 seconds. And this is a very nice recording by Victoria Soames-Samek of the Tailleferre Arabesque. That's what you might more commonly hear in one of Tailleferre's works. So if you aren't familiar yet with the Clarinet Sonata, once we listen to some of that, I think it'll strike you how contrasting this language is. this sonata for solo clarinet was dedicated to Henri Dionnet, who was the second soloist at the Paris Opera, which is like the biggest gig in France for clarinet, or one of the biggest gigs, rather. I guess the first soloist would be the biggest gig. And he was also a professor at the Versailles Conservatory. He lived from 1911 to 2006. It was a wonderful clarinetist. First, let's listen to the first movement of the Tailleferre Sonata. This is actually one of 3 recordings I was able to find. There's only 2 commercial releases that I was able to find, one by Victoria Somsamic, which is on the same disc as the Arabesque we just listened to, and Deborah Marshall's recording. She's a fantastic clarinetist. I think she lives in Colorado now. She's retired. But this one was a recording that Jenny McClay, who was formerly staff for the International Clarinet Association, created. So it's a very nice recording. We're going to listen to her first movement, and then we'll talk about that movement a little further. So as you heard, this is a completely different language from what we heard in her Arabesque. So a couple things. I hope that you all have a copy of the score. If you don't, rumor has it there are scans of it available on a quick Google search. I'm not going to share it here because it is still under copyright. If you haven't numbered your measures, I suggest you quick do that. That's not, it's not a very long piece, so it's pretty quick because I'm going to reference some measure numbers as we work through it. So a couple things that you'll notice when you look through this score is that Tailleferre uses a lot of commas, which wind players often associate as breath marks. You know, we write them for our students, little comma, it's a breath mark. As she trained as a violinist, I don't think that these commas are really breath marks. Sometimes they actually coincide with rests, which are obvious places to breathe. Rather, I think she uses these to indicate places that she expects time to be used. I think it's not a bad idea to be kind of irregular about how much time you use so that it's not so measured. That can also really help indicate the gesture to the audience. These can totally be at the discretion of the performer how long you might like to hold a comma. Note in example 1 through 14, we'll see 1, 2, 3, 4 commas. Although it's not notated, when you get to measure 15, we'll note that that follows a 5-measure accelerando. I suggest that be treated as an a tempo as it returns to the opening material as an echo. So I think the tempo should match. At measure 36, there is a dotted half-note trill, and I think that Jenny McClay did a really nice job with this by shaping it by starting slower and then getting faster so that it has musical interest. And I think that's a good practice. At measure 41, Tailleferre has an accelerando, and I think this works nicely as a vehicle to arrive at the quarter note triplets that occur in measure 45. So I like, when I've performed this, I set that as the new tempo and kind of in alla breve or cut time. And this can continue at this new tempo until Tailleferre marks pianissimo calmato at measure 53. And at that place, I like to do that in a gradual way to return to the opening tempo to the end. Although you could make a case to simply do that subito if you like. So it's up to you. Throughout this movement, I think it's really important to pay attention to the details of expression. She writes a lot of dynamics and she uses a lot of terrace dynamics. So for example, measure 1 is marked forte, measure 2 piano, then measure 3 is forte again. And that's a trend throughout. And I think it's really important to exaggerate those details of dynamic contrast. I think it's, lastly, I think it's very important to note the tempo marking only exists at the beginning of the first movement, which is quarter equals 84. So I interpret that as that's supposed to be quarter equals quarter throughout the 3 movements of the piece, or 1/8 equals 1/8. And that takes us to a natural transition to movement 2. And I did the math. Movement 2, if we're keeping the 1/8 or the quarter the same, should be at dotted quarter note equals 56, as it's at 6/8 rather than 4/4. So you certainly want to feel the big beats. Let's go ahead and listen to a recording of the second movement now. And this one is from Deborah Marshall. I like to say that we should again treat this music in a gestural manner with lots of shape and conviction. Even though it has this sort of abstract language to it and it's very skippy, I think it does have a very tranquil lyrical nature to it. As I know many of you may be teaching this to your high school students for entry into the competition. When I was in high school, I wasn't personally the most open-minded about contemporary music, so you might have to sell it. I would say that it's important to feel the dotted quarter note again. However, note that there is at times a feeling of 3/4, and Tailleferre implies this either through the beaming or through the articulation. An example of the beaming would be in measure 2, where there are quarter notes, as one could have done that with 2 8 notes tied together. She chose to use quarters. And then another example of a place where we might see articulation included to emphasize that further is in measure 19, where there are 2 note groupings. If this idea of 3/4 is contained within a slur, we could shape towards the second quarter note and then resolve into the third, like a rhythmic phrase. One example of that is, of course, actually the first 2 measures. So I think that's the way to show that aspect of her music. Again, make dynamic contrast very, very profoundly clear. Piano, forte, pianissimo, forte, just very important to be very clear and obvious about those things. At measure 22, Tailleferre doesn't actually include a tempo modification, but I think it's kind of nice here to interpret the 3 tenuto A flats as like a little bit more held back. And then a tempo in measure 23. Also, that A flat is a peculiar sounding note. It doesn't seem to be, the one that you expect that phrase to conclude on. So I think it's important to play with conviction there and time. All right, now on to the third movement, which is pretty thorny looking, but I think it's a little more manageable if you remember that the tempo is marked quarter equals 84, and that is to be throughout. Although most of the recordings seem to want to take it faster than that, which is kind of cool, but maybe not exactly the composer's intention. And this is Victoria Sohn-Samek's recording, which is found on that same album as the arabesques that we listened to earlier. It's fun to hear that at a faster tempo, but it makes it tougher. But I would say that this movement, it's important, again, to pay careful attention to dynamics throughout. Tailleferre is very specific. I like to think of each 16th note gesture as leading to the next group of 8th notes. So adding a little bit of an energetic crescendo is really helpful. That also helps keep one's fingers moving and also takes care of the music. So Important technical issue I noticed with this movement is to keep the embouchure firm, and clear articulation is very important, and wind in motion when navigating intervals that cross the break, because this happens throughout the movement, and that can be quite tricky. That's always important in clarinet playing, but I noticed it particularly in this movement could be a challenge for the young clarinetist. In the cadenza, I noticed that Tailleferre gradually expands the range. Her first gesture goes to the first note in the altissimo register, the C sharp, then the second up to an E sharp, then up to a G, and finishes again on a G. So I like to personally start softer, on the softer side, like a finissimo dynamic, and then grow up to maybe mezzo piano, then down to piano, up to mezzo forte, etc., so that I'm showing a greater range of dynamics. She doesn't write anything like that. She just puts in hairpins. But that's my personal way of pacing that phrase. In measure 5 and 7, that is quite thorny. Going quickly between C sharp and B. In my experimentation with this, I figured out that I could play the C sharp with the B lever down, and it wasn't, because it's so quick, it's not real audible. That may be helpful to your students or yourself. I think that the speed and fluidity trump the little bit of a discrepancy of intonation and timbre that you could experience because it's so quick. Measure 16 through 19, Tailleferre uses the same notes but different articulations. So I think it's important to observe those differences in these measures of music. Now in measure 20, this is where Tailleferre pulls back to recitativo lento, or a very slow tempo. And I think that you can't start it too slowly. That leaves a lot of room in the last measure for a super dramatic accelerando to the final altissimo G. Those are my performance notes on the piece. So I didn't have anybody volunteer to play by email, but I thought that I would leave a time at the end if you have questions about the piece that are specific to the technique of it, and I could advise you accordingly. And feel free to drop them in the chat.
Well, I certainly have questions.
Oh, great.
So I'll start, and you guys can contribute questions as you think of them. I'm specifically looking at measure 15 and 16 in the second movement.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious what your recommended fingerings for that section would be.
That's a great question.
F sharp to F natural to G sharp is a little bit clunky, just going from those partials. So I was curious how you approach that.
Absolutely. When I performed this, I actually ended up just using the regular fingerings, but for F sharp, I think it's really important to depress the sliver on the right hand. This, otherwise it's flat and unresponsive. So you have to prepare the voicing down to G sharp. Larry Guy wrote about this in his book, Embouchure Building, and the syllable that he recommends using when crossing from altissimo notes to clarion notes by descent and legato is yeah. And I've always found that really, really helpful. You could make a case to use the long fingerings here, though. And I didn't personally do that, but I could certainly see how somebody might use long F sharp, this guy here, which is 1, 2, thumb register, 1, 2, 3, and A flat, E flat here. And then long F, that would be another option, which is thumb register 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then C sharp, G sharp. I bet that would be really helpful to high school students for the altissimo notes. It's because they're so easily responsive, those fingerings, the long fingerings. So you could do it either way, depending on your instrument, your setup, and all that.
So keep in mind too, if you're practicing this, that F, if you use a regular F fingering, could be really out of tune in this section. And this movement is not really fast enough for you to to hold on to that note for too long. So you want to check the intonation on those notes when you're working on what he prescribed as the long fingerings, or using the regular fingering that's suggested there.
Yeah. You can also, this sliver can be depressed for regular F if that tends to be low on your instrument. It does vary. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it is not.
And when you use that sliver, be careful. I like to go a little further back on it so that I'm not accidentally hitting the ring key. Yeah.
That is vital. Yeah. I actually press this like
right in that area.
Right in this area. I tell my students that they could cut half the key off and they'd be fine. Actually, on my E flat clarinet, I had half of those keys removed because I can't press them without depressing the ring. So there's no point in having those options.
Okay. Anybody have questions? Feel free to either unmute yourself and ask that question, or feel free to type it in the chat. Otherwise, I'm just going to continue to ask my own questions that I have written down as I'm listening here. So everybody probably has a question about practicing that last measure of the third movement up to the high G. And it's written with no slur marking in the score that I'm looking at. So I'm curious if you feel that should be articulated on the 30-second notes.
I think that that's where I think the key here is to make sure that you start this recitativo section lento enough. Like I pulled it back. I pulled it back to like probably almost half tempo when I performed it, so that it seemed more achievable to articulate the 30-second notes rather than add a slur. But you can make a case for a slur if you wanted to go faster, for example. But I found articulation to be doable, with some practice. So that would be something like eighth note equals 84 to start. And the accelerando should probably stop when you get to the 30-second notes. It's kind of playing safe, but I mean, it's fast,
What's the recommended fingering for that high G? Is it 1-3-1-3 or?
There's a couple different things you could do there. Approaching it from C sharp, I would probably trying to remember. I wrote it right there. There it is. I think I simply did overblown B plus E flat, A flat, and the sliver. That's kind of my go-to fingering for that note. Yao Guang Zai in the Baltimore Symphony uses that one a lot. Actually, that's a helpful fingering for the cadenza as well. I believe that's the fingering that I used for both instances of G there, because it stays in the same partial or register as E, even though you're flipping. It's really pretty smooth. So that would be just like clarion B plus sliver right hand and A flat, E flat.
As we mentioned, this piece is on the repertoire list for this year's high school competition. The deadline for applications for the high school competition is April 1st. And I earlier posted the link, but I'm going to post it again here in the chat. So if you're interested, or if you are a student, or if you have a student that you are thinking that they might want to compete, this piece and Concertino by Weber are on the repertoire list. And both of those pieces, I think, are quite approachable. Both of the pieces are quite approachable for high school students. So I hope that you will enter, or encourage your students to enter the competition. And if you have questions about that, obviously you can email me at edo@clarinet.org, and I'm happy to help with that. So is there anything else that you think is important, especially for a high school student who hasn't really worked on an unaccompanied piece? Everybody has worked on etudes and scales and things like that, but there's something really different about preparing an etude versus preparing an unaccompanied piece. And so I'm curious if you have suggestions for students who are approaching the piece for the first time as maybe their first unaccompanied piece and in this competition piece.
I think that's a wonderful question, Jessica. I remember actually the first time I played something unaccompanied, I found it kind of terrifying versus like with piano. And when I last performed this, it was actually in a conference in Denton, and it was sort of actually my like personal COVID battle was to get more comfortable with unaccompanied literature. So I had to take a different philosophy to with it, and I just I tell my students this too. It's not unaccompanied. It's a duet with silence.
I think
Um,
that's a good way to think about it. It's
yeah.
very easy, especially in the last movement, I'm sure, to get increasingly fast when you have no one to hold you back in your tempo,
Yes.
when you play unaccompanied pieces, especially faster. And also making sure that you're taking necessary breaths to refill your tank when you have the moment to do that, and taking the time in the space in the piece. Just because there's silence doesn't mean that that silence isn't appropriate in the unaccompanied piece. That actually, as Chris is suggesting, is part of the music. Is giving the music time to breathe so that the audience can absorb what it is that you're putting forward in the piece. And a lot of these breath marks, as you have, the commas that are there, are intended to sort of phrase the piece, but also give you a moment to collect yourself before you move on to the next musical idea. So I think that's really important when you're working through that. And when you're practicing it, those are also great ways to sort of segment how you want to approach practicing this piece. I've got, two measures in the beginning. Let's focus on those two measures and making sure that that's one cohesive musical idea before I move on to the next section. And I think that, this piece does a really nice job of helping you sort of pace yourself by indicating those markings for sure.
I note that in the third movement, actually, Tailleferre does not give you any commas.
Yeah.
So that one really is like it could become a race to the end. Something I've always found helpful when teaching this kind of thing that has a lot of 16th notes, if a student has that propensity to rush, I call it the helper tenuto, which is the tenuto that we put on the first 16th note of every group of 16th notes that is slurred together, unless the first 16th note happens to be like a staccato note followed by three slurred notes, that's a different situation than this. But that can really help keep people from rushing ahead to feel more well-grounded. That last movement in particular, I can't stress how important it is to set a realistic tempo, like because the 30-second notes in measure 5 and 7 they're kind of crazy. And again, and also at the end, just be careful about setting a successful tempo. Although it's unaccompanied, it's a really good idea to practice this with a metronome, so that you don't get into that propensity of rushing forward with repeated material, because that could be dangerous. And cause some
I think that's no more clear than the third and fourth line when you have the 16th notes followed by a passage of 30-second notes that are descending and rushing into the next one, and that tempo will just snowball on itself, and then you find yourself in a speed that is unattainable, especially heading into that the last three lines with all of those repeated notes. So
yes.
Luckily you have the cadenza in there to sort of bookend that, to keep you from running away the entire time. But
absolutely.
Well, my last question, if no one else has any questions, I'm looking at the last three lines, specifically the two lines prior to the final line with the pianissimo, and I'm thinking about how you would practice this with groupings, or specifically because there are articulation markings and then there's some 16ths that are unmarked. And I'm wondering about how if you practice grouping, if do you have suggestions on how people should approach, since there's so many accidentals?
Yes, absolutely. So I think breaking it down is very important. And notice that there is actually a pattern here. So the first thing that I do when approaching crazy passages like this is I try to notice if there's a pattern, and then it makes it seem a little more doable. So the first two beats is simply repeated, 1, 2, 3. And almost 4 times, but the rhythm changes at the end. So it's just this simple 8-note set. So a couple different ways that you could approach that. I think the first thing is, because there is mixed articulation, it's not a bad idea to try it without articulation at first, to make sure that your finger coordination is absolutely 100% rock solid. I suggest using right hand B because it's kind of skippy. You don't have to, but I think it's a good idea. Then I would actually suggest perhaps playing it with a consistent articulation. You could articulate every note then. For some reason, I find that helps me even things out. And then by intentionally ignoring the articulations twice, that kind of nags at me. It's just the way that I am. So then I really feel like I have to do them. So that's a nice way of working on that, to be mindful of mixed articulations and really observing what's there. There's more of a pattern in the second half, or measures 18 and 19.
And with, is there an errata in that last measure of this 4-bar phrase? With it looks like written on my score, there's an F sharp. And I'm wondering if that's supposed to be an E sharp, as it would match the rest of the, unless my version is bad. But
I think there's only one edition. It's Wrongwen music.
Yeah.
Okay, so which could you say which measure that is again?
That's 1, 2, 3 from the end. The second group of 16th notes. It's written F sharp, but I believe that should be an E sharp.
Yeah, I did. That is. I think that is an errata.
So if you're working on this, I'd make a note of that. I think that is intended to be an E sharp. As there's only one edition, it's really hard to find out, the intended note here. But I think matching, because this is the same, basically the same four groups of 16ths or triplets there, and the notes are the same each time. Yes. So I think it's just
that is likely errata.
Yeah.
Thank you for pointing that out, Jessica.
Yeah, no problem.
I think I actually didn't even notice that. I just learned an E sharp.
I mean, for the ear, it's pretty consistent all the way throughout. So
yeah, that would be jarring.
Okay. Well, if no one else has any questions, I think we can end it here. I really appreciate you, Chris, so much for coming out and working through this piece for us. Again, if you're going to enter the competition or have a student that's going to enter, please be mindful of the deadline of April 1st. There is a $35 entry fee for the competition, and you do need to be an ICA member. But lucky for you, ICA students can get a student membership for just $10, which is an incredible deal. So we will have more sessions like this coming soon. Hopefully we'll have one on some other topics from the New Music Committee, and we may do another session like this for the Young Artist Competition on some of the repertoire for that, possibly the piece called Blush by Genon. So be sure to look out for that. And let's thank Chris again for coming out. And this recording, if you joined us late, will be up on our YouTube channel shortly as soon as I'm able to get it edited and uploaded. So thanks again, and we will see you soon. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.